This is the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis.
There is a line in the latest announcement from the BBC that should give anyone who cares about British broadcasting real pause. Because cutting up to 1 in 10 jobs is not a routine adjustment or a gentle efficiency drive, but a deep and deliberate reduction in the scale of the organisation itself. The corporation plans to remove between 1,800 and 2,000 roles in order to save £500 million. And when the interim Director General, Rhodri Townsend-Davies, openly admits that nothing is off the table, including entire channels or services, it becomes clear that this is not simply about balancing the books, but about reshaping the BBC in a far more fundamental way than the public is being encouraged to recognise. What we are seeing here is not a moment of careful reform, but the continuation of a long pattern where each round of cuts is presented as necessary and contained, yet each one leaves the organisation smaller, tighter, and less able to deliver the breadth and ambition that once defined it. The official explanation leans heavily on familiar language about financial pressures, rising production costs, and declining income from the licence fee. And while all of those pressures are real, they do not fully explain why the response always seems to land in the same place, which is fewer people, fewer resources, and a quieter version of what the BBC used to be. There is a difference between adapting to change and retreating in the face of it, and at the moment the BBC appears to be doing more of the latter than the former, which raises serious questions about whether there is a long-term vision driving these decisions, or simply a need to make the numbers work in the short term. When you remove up to 2,000 people from an organisation that relies on skill, experience and editorial judgment, you are not trimming excess, but you're cutting into the very fabric of what makes the output work. Because programmes don't create themselves, and journalism doesn't happen by accident. The impact of these decisions won't be immediate in a dramatic sense, because the BBC is large and resilient enough to absorb the initial shock. But over time, the effect becomes clear in ways that are harder to measure, yet impossible to ignore. As coverage becomes thinner, ideas become safer, and the distinctive edge that once set the BBC apart begins to fade. This is exactly why unions such as BECTU and the National Union of Journalists have reacted so strongly, warning that cuts on this scale will damage not only the workforce, but the output itself, because there's a direct link between the people who make programmes and the quality of what ends up on screen, on air and online. When these voices describe the situation as death by 1,000 cuts, it may sound dramatic, yet it reflects a reality that has been building for years, as successive rounds of savings have already stretched teams, reduced local presence, and centralised decision-making to a point where there is very little slack left in the system. But what makes this moment more troubling is the wider context in which it sits, because the BBC isn't operating in a stable or forgiving media landscape, but in one that is increasingly dominated by global platforms, fast-moving misinformation, and a growing concentration of power in the hands of a small number of multinational companies. In that environment, the need for a strong, well-funded public service broadcaster isn't a luxury, but a necessity, because it provides a level of trust, accountability, and depth that is difficult to replicate elsewhere. Yet the current approach risks weakening exactly those qualities at the moment they're most needed. The political backdrop only adds to the uncertainty, as the future of the licence fee remains unresolved ahead of the next Royal Charter renewal, and comments from figures such as Lisa Nandy about the need for difficult decisions and greater commercial thinking suggest that the pressure on the BBC to change its model is unlikely to ease anytime soon. There's also a sense of awkward timing that is hard to ignore, because these cuts are being set in motion just weeks before Matt Britton takes over as Director General, which means that the incoming leadership will inherit not a stable organisation ready for renewal, but one already deep into a period of contraction and uncertainty. And that raises an uncomfortable question about whether this is intended to create a clean slate for new leadership, or whether it simply leaves them with the difficult task of managing the consequences of decisions that have already been made, because there is a significant difference between shaping a future and dealing with the fallout of the past. The BBC often talks about protecting its core services, and while that sounds reassuring, it is worth asking what that promise really means in practice when the resources behind those services are being steadily reduced. because a service can exist in name while losing much of the depth, originality and reach that once made it valuable. Audiences may not notice the change overnight, yet over time the shift becomes clear as the range narrows, the risks diminish, and the sense of authority that once defined the BBC begins to erode in subtle but important ways. This is how institutions change, not through a single dramatic moment, but through a series of decisions that each seem manageable on their own, yet collectively alter the character of the whole. At its best, the BBC has always been more than the sum of its parts, because it has had the confidence and the backing to inform, educate and entertain in ways that others could not, whether through ambitious journalism, distinctive programming, or a willingness to serve audiences that the market alone would overlook. The concern now is that this confidence is being replaced by caution, and that the organisation is being shaped less by what it believes it should be, and more by what it feels it can afford to be, which is a very different and far more limited proposition. The language of financial pressures may soften the message, yet it cannot hide the underlying reality that the BBC is shrinking, and while that may solve a short-term problem on a balance sheet, it risks creating a long-term problem for the quality and scope of the service that the public ultimately receives. Once that depth is lost, it is not easily rebuilt because the skills, experience, and institutional knowledge that walk out of the door with each redundancy do not simply return when conditions improve. So what we are witnessing then is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation where the BBC becomes smaller, quieter, and less central to the national conversation, not because of a single decision, but because of many decisions that all point in the same direction. The real question is not whether the BBC can survive this moment, because it almost certainly will, but whether it will remain the kind of broadcaster it was designed to be, or whether it will emerge as something more limited, more cautious, and ultimately less vital than before. And that is a far more serious issue than any savings target, because once an institution like the BBC loses that sense of purpose and scale, restoring it becomes far harder than cutting it ever was.
This has been the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis, a Red Telephone Box production.